When you lose the love of your life, every sunrise feels like punishment. Old Hank Redfern knew that pain better than most. 40 years of marriage gone in a hospital room, leaving him with nothing but memories and his loyal hound, Buck. That's why he bought Widow's Reach for $100. The ghost town sat forgotten in the high desert, its empty cabins perfect for a man who wanted to disappear. Hank figured he'd fix a few boards, tend a small garden, and wait for his time to come. But the Baker family was already there. They'd been waiting 50 years, never aging, never leaving, never quite alive. Sarah still hung her washing. Tom still worked his mine. Their children still played in dusty streets. As Hank starts mending what's broken, he discovers some repairs go deeper than wood and nails. But what happens when fixing a ghost town means facing the ghosts in your own heart? Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Hank Redfern saw Martha Caldwell, she was wrestling with a stubborn coffee pot in the diner where she worked, her auburn hair catching the morning light like autumn fire. That was 43 years ago, back when his joints didn't creak like old barn doors, and his hands could still hold steady enough to thread a needle. He'd been a young ranch hand then, barely 27, with calloused palms and dreams bigger than his bank account. "Coffee's burned again," she'd announced to the whole diner, not a lick of shame in her voice. "But it's the only coffee we got, so you'll drink it and pretend it tastes like heaven." Hank had laughed, really laughed, for the first time since his daddy passed. Something about her honesty, the way she looked life square in the eye without flinching, made him want to stick around Millfield longer than he'd planned. One cup of terrible coffee turned into 40 years of marriage, a small ranch outside town, and the kind of love that makes a man believe in providence. Martha never did learn to make decent coffee, but she could coax roses from hard-pan dirt, sing harmony to his off-key hymns, and make him feel like the luckiest fool alive every morning when she'd hand him that first awful cup and kiss his cheek. The cancer came quiet-like, the way bad things often do. Started with a cough she couldn't shake, then the tiredness that sleep wouldn't cure. By the time the doctors had a name for it, the thing had already made itself at home in her lungs, spreading through her chest like bindweed through a garden. "Promise me something," she'd whispered that last night in the hospital, her voice thin as paper, but her grip on his hand still strong. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band he'd saved 3 months to buy, caught the fluorescent light as she squeezed his fingers. "Don't you go disappearing on me after I'm gone. Find something worth staying for," Hank had promised, the way husbands do when their wives are dying. He'd have promised her the moon if she'd asked. But promises made in hospital rooms carried different weight in the cold light of morning. The funeral drew half the county. Martha had taught Sunday school for 30 years, organized church suppers, and never met a stray she wouldn't feed. The casseroles came for weeks after, along with kind words and gentle pats on the shoulder. But eventually the world moved on, the way worlds do, leaving Hank alone in a house that echoed with 40 years of shared laughter. For months he wandered. Not physically, he still fed the cattle, fixed fence, kept the ranch running, because that's what Martha would have wanted. But inside, where it mattered, Hank Redfern was lost as a child in a cornfield. He'd catch himself setting 2 places at the dinner table, brewing enough coffee for 2, starting conversations with empty air. Buck had been Martha's dog originally, a red-coated mutt with mismatched ears she'd found half-starved on the highway. The dog seemed to understand loss better than most humans. He'd lie at Hank's feet during the long evenings, brown eyes full of patient sympathy, never demanding more than Hank could give. It was Buck who found the newspaper clipping that changed everything. Hank had been sitting in Martha's chair, something he'd started doing in the worst moments, when the dog came trotting in with a page from last week's paper in his mouth. Real estate section, crumpled and damp with dog slobber, but readable enough. "Ghost town for sale," the tiny ad read. "Widows. Reach, Nevada." Historic mining settlement, 47 structures, 160 acres. Serious inquiries only, $100 firm, $100. Less than what most folks spent on groceries in a week. The ad included a phone number and an address that seemed pulled from another. Century, Widow's Reach, Nevada, population 0. Hank stared at that clipping for the better part of an hour. Martha's ring sat in his shirt pocket. He'd taken to carrying it after the funeral, couldn't bear to leave it in the jewelry box with her. Other things? The metal felt warm against his chest as he traced the ad's words with one finger. Population 0. That sounded about right for a man who felt like a ghost himself. The phone call took all of 5 minutes. A bored-sounding clerk at some county office confirmed the details. Widow's Reach was a legitimate ghost town, abandoned since the mining bust of the 1970s. The county wanted it off their books, and $100 cash would transfer the deed to anyone fool enough to want it. Fair warning, the clerk had added. There's no power, no water, no phone service, roads barely passable. You sure you want to buy a pile of old buildings in the middle of nowhere? Hank looked around his empty house at the coffee cups he couldn't bring himself to wash, at the chair where Martha used to sit, reading her gardening magazines. Yes, ma'am, I'm sure. The drive to Nevada took 2 days, Hank and Buck sharing the cab of his old Ford pickup. They drove through country that got bigger and emptier with each mile, past towns that looked half-forgotten themselves. Hank had sold the ranch to a young family from Colorado, a couple with babies and dreams, and that same hopeful look he and Martha had worn 40 years ago. The money sat in his bank account, more than enough to live out his days quiet and simple. The turn-off to Widow's Reach was marked by a weathered sign so faded you had to squint to read it. 15 miles of dirt road later, winding through high desert scrub and red rock formations that looked older than memory, they found it. The town sat in a natural bowl between 2 ridges, maybe 40 buildings, scattered along what had once been a main street. Time and weather had worked on them the way water works on stone, patient and thorough. Some structures still stood proud, their wooden walls silvered by decades of sun and wind. Others had given up the fight, collapsing into themselves like tired old men, settling into favorite chairs. Hank pulled the truck to a stop in what might have been the town square. A dry fountain sat in the center, its concrete bowl filled with tumbleweeds and dreams deferred. To the east, mine tailings spilled down the hillside like gray scars against the red earth. The whole place felt suspended in time, as if the world had moved on and forgotten to take Widow's Reach with it. "What do you think, Buck?" Hank asked, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Quiet enough for you?" Buck whined softly and pressed against Hank's leg, the way he did when thunder was coming. But the sky stretched clear and blue from horizon to horizon. Not a cloud in sight. They spent that first afternoon exploring. Most of the buildings were empty shells, roofs caved in, windows broken, floors thick with dust and debris. But near the end of what had been Main Street, Hank found a cabin that looked promising. 2 rooms, stone foundation, roof intact, except for a few missing shingles. Someone had built it to last, with thick walls and solid timber framing. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon light. The previous occupant had left behind a few pieces of furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that might work with some cleaning. On the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace, someone had carved words into the wood. "Home is where love lives." Hank ran his fingers over the carved letters, feeling the careful work of hands, long stilled. Martha would have liked this place, he thought. She'd have seen past the dust and decay to the bones of something good. As the sun settled toward the western ridge, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Hank made his decision. This was as good a place as any to fade away quiet-like. He could fix what needed fixing, plant a small garden if the soil would take it, and wait for whatever came next. Buck seemed less certain. The dog kept looking over his shoulder, ears pricked like he was listening to sounds Hank couldn't hear. But dogs were sensitive creatures, and the desert held all kinds of sounds a man might miss. Wind through stone, the distant cry of hawks, the settling of old wood. That night they slept in the truck bed under a blanket of stars, thick as thrown rice. The silence was different here than back home. Deeper, older, like the kind of quiet that settles on churches and graveyards. But it suited Hank just fine. He'd had enough noise and bustle to last him. Just before sleep took him, he thought he heard something. Footsteps on hard-packed earth, the distant sound of a woman humming. But when he raised his head to listen, there was nothing but wind and the soft breathing of his sleeping dog. Desert nights played tricks on a man's ears, he knew. Out here, where the air was thin and the silence thick, a fellow could hear all sorts of things that weren't really there. Just his mind working through the changes, the way grief sometimes dressed itself up as other things. Tomorrow, he'd start the work of making this place livable. Nothing fancy, just the basics a man and his dog needed to get by. Clean out the cabin, patch what needed patching, maybe rig up some way to catch rainwater when the storms came. It would be good to have work again, something to fill the hours that stretched too long without Martha's voice to mark their passing. Physical labor had always been his answer to life's complications. Fix what could be fixed, accept what couldn't, and keep moving forward one day at a time. As sleep finally claimed him, Hank's hand found Martha's ring in his shirt pocket. The metal had cooled in the desert air, but it still carried the weight of 40 years' worth of love and promises. Some things, he thought drowsily, were worth carrying no matter how heavy they got. Dawn came slow to Widow's Reach, painting the eastern ridge in shades of rose and gold before spilling down into the valley like honey from a jar. Hank woke to Buck's low whine, the dog's body tense against his leg in the truck bed. The air carried. The sharp bite of high desert morning, clean and thin enough to make a man's lungs work for every breath. "Easy, boy," Hank murmured, sitting up and stretching muscles that protested the night spent on a makeshift bed. Buck wasn't looking at him, though. The dog's attention was fixed on something across the town square, his ears pricked forward and a soft rumble building in his chest. Hank followed the dog's gaze and felt his breath catch. There, clear as morning. Light. A woman stood beside what had once been the town's general store. She wore a simple blue dress that might have been fashionable decades ago, her dark hair pinned back in a style that belonged to another time. She was hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts, white sheets and cotton dresses that moved. In a breeze Hank couldn't feel. He blinked hard, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. The desert air could play tricks on a man's vision, especially in the early morning, when the light was just finding its way into the world. Heat mirages, they called them, though the air was still cool enough to raise goosebumps on his arms. One day he looked again. She was still there, still hanging clothes with the patient care of a woman who'd done this chore 1,000 times before. The white fabric snapped and billowed in that unfelt wind, bright as prayer flags against the weathered wood of the building behind her. Buck whined again, the sound carrying a note Hank had never heard before. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like the dog was seeing something he understood but couldn't explain. "You see her too, don't you, boy?" Hank whispered. The woman must have heard something. She turned toward them, her face coming clear in the growing light. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to welcome visitors. She'd been expecting for years. She raised one hand in a gentle wave, the gesture as natural as breathing. Hank's throat went dry. He'd been alone in this place for less than 12 hours, but he knew with the certainty that comes from 40 years of early mornings, that no one else had been here when they'd arrived yesterday. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice cracking, like a teenager's. "Ma'am, I didn't know anyone else was—" But when he blinked again, she was gone. The clothesline stood empty. No sheets or dresses dancing in the wind. The posts that had held the line were still there, weathered and real, but the rope had rotted away years ago. leaving only a few frayed ends that moved in the actual morning. Breeze. Hank climbed down from the truck bed on unsteady legs, Buck jumping down beside him. Together, they walked across the dusty square toward the general store. Up close, the building showed its age, windows clouded with decades of dust, door hanging askew on rusted hinges, porch boards warped and split from countless seasons of heat and cold. But where the woman had stood, the earth was different. Not disturbed exactly, but somehow more settled, as if feet had walked this path recently enough to leave an impression in the soul of the place, if not the soil itself. "What do you make of that, Buck?" The dog sniffed the ground where she'd been, standing, his tail moving in a slow, uncertain wag. Whatever scent he found there, it wasn't threatening. If anything, Buck seemed calmer now, the tension leaving his shoulders as he explored the area with the focused attention he usually reserved for interesting rabbit holes. Hank found himself drawn to the building's front door. The wood had swollen in its frame, and it took a firm push to get it open. Inside, dust particles danced in the morning light, streaming through grimy windows. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty except for a few forgotten items. A rusted can of peaches, a bolt of fabric faded beyond recognition, a child's toy horse missing 3 legs. But on the counter near the back, someone had left a basket of what looked like fresh apples, red and shiny, without a mark on them, as if they'd been picked yesterday. The smell of them filled the air with sweetness that seemed impossible in this forgotten place. Hank approached the basket slowly, half convinced it would disappear like the woman and her laundry. But the apples remained solid and real under his touch. He picked one up, feeling its weight, its perfect smoothness. When he bit into it, juice ran down his chin, sweet and crisp as any apple he'd ever tasted. "Desert heat's getting to me," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty store. "That's all it is, mind playing tricks." But Buck had found something else. The dog was standing in front of a glass case near the back wall, his tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm. Inside the case, arranged as carefully as if the store were still open for business, sat a collection of items that made Hank's chest tighten with recognition. A man's pocket watch, its gold case polished to a shine. A woman's hair ribbon, blue. A summer sky. 2 children's books, their pages pristine as if they'd been read and loved but never damaged. And beside them, a family photograph in a silver frame. The picture showed 4 people arranged in the formal style of decades past. A man in work clothes with strong hands and honest eyes. A woman in a blue dress, the same blue dress Hank had seen on the figure by the clothesline. 2 children, a girl maybe 8 years old and a boy who couldn't have been more than 5, both of them grinning with the unself-conscious joy that belongs only to the young. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in careful script, "The Baker Family, Widow's Reach, 1973. Hank studied their faces, feeling an odd sense of familiarity. These weren't strangers. Somehow, in the space of one impossible morning, they'd become something more. The woman's smile was the same one she'd offered him across the town square. The man's eyes held the kind of steady strength Hank recognized in his own mirror. Back, when he'd been younger and the world had made more sense. "Baker family," he murmured, tasting the name. It felt right in his mouth, like words he'd been waiting all his life to say. Buck whined softly and pressed against Hank's leg. Outside, the sun had climbed high enough to flood the valley with golden light, but inside the store, shadows seemed to gather in the corners, like visitors waiting to be acknowledged. Hank replaced the apple basket on the counter and backed toward the door, his eyes never leaving the photograph. As he reached the threshold, he could have sworn he heard something. The distant sound of children's laughter, faint as an echo, but warm as a summer afternoon. The smart thing would be to pack up the truck and head back to civilization. Find a motel in the nearest town. Maybe see a doctor about the things he'd been seeing and hearing. Grief did strange things to a man's mind, and he'd heard of folks who'd lost their spouses having all kinds of episodes. But as he stood in the doorway, of that empty store, looking out at a town that should have been dead, but somehow wasn't, Hank Redfern made a different choice. He'd come here to disappear, to fade away quiet-like until his time came. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to be alone after all. "Well, Buck," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "looks like we might have neighbors. Guess we better make ourselves presentable." Buck's tail wagged agreement, and together they walked back toward their chosen cabin. Behind them, if Hank had turned to look, he might have seen 4 figures watching from the windows of the general store. A family that had been waiting 50 years for someone to see them, to acknowledge their presence in this place between worlds. But Hank didn't look back. He had work to do, a life to rebuild, and the strangest feeling that for the first time since Martha's death, he wasn't entirely alone in the world. The work helped settle Hank's mind, the way physical labor always had. He spent the morning hauling debris from his chosen cabin, sweeping out decades of dust and leaves, checking the stone foundation for cracks that might let in winter cold. Buck supervised from the shade of a twisted juniper, occasionally investigating interesting scents, but never straying far from Hank's side. By noon, the cabin looked almost livable. The walls were solid, the roof sound, except for 3 missing shingles that Hank could replace with wood from the collapsed buildings. The cast-iron stove would work once he cleaned out the chimney and found some proper pipe to replace the rusted sections. It was honest work, the kind that reminded a man he still had purpose in the world. Every board he straightened, every window he cleaned, felt like a small victory against the creeping sense that he'd become as much of a ghost as this abandoned town. But the feeling of being watched never quite left him. It started as a tickle between his shoulder blades, the sense that eyes were following his movements. When he'd turned to look, there was nothing but empty buildings and desert scrub. Yet the feeling persisted, not threatening, but curious, like neighbors checking out the newcomer from behind their curtains. Around midday, while replacing a broken window pane with cardboard and tape, Hank heard it again, the sound of work being done somewhere else in town. The rhythmic strike of metal on stone, echoing off the canyon walls, in a pattern that spoke of long practice and steady purpose. He set down his tools and followed the sound, Buck trotting beside him with ears pricked forward. The noise led them up a winding path toward the old mine workings, past rusted equipment and tailings piles that spoke of dreams pursued and abandoned. The mine entrance was a dark mouth cut into the hillside, supported by timber that should have rotted decades ago, but still looked solid as the day it was hewn. From somewhere deep in that darkness came the sound of digging, the scrape of shovel against stone, the thunk of a pickaxe finding its mark. "Hello?" Hank called into the tunnel. His voice echoed back empty, but the digging sounds continued, steady and methodical. Buck whined and refused to go closer, planting his feet and looking up at Hank with worried eyes. The dog's instincts had kept them both out of trouble more times than Hank could count, and he wasn't about to ignore them now. Instead, he circled the mine entrance, looking for other ways in or signs of recent activity. Near a pile of old equipment he found them, tools that shouldn't have been there. A pickaxe with a wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands, its metal head free of the rust that should have claimed it years ago. A shovel with dirt still clinging to its blade, the earth dark and damp as if it had been turned that very morning. Hank picked up the pickaxe, feeling the warmth of the wood against his palms. The tool had weight and balance, crafted by someone who understood mining. Work. On the handle, carved in simple letters, were the initials TB, Tom Baker, the man from the photograph. As if summoned by the recognition, a figure appeared at the mine entrance. Not clearly at first, more like a shadow that gradually took on shape and substance in the dim light. But as Hank's eyes adjusted, he could make out the form of a man, broad-shouldered and strong, wearing the kind of work clothes that spoke of honest labor. The man, Tom Baker, it had to be, nodded to Hank with the simple courtesy of one working man acknowledging another. Then he turned and disappeared back into the darkness, the sound of his digging resuming with steady, purposeful rhythm. Hank stood there for a long moment, the warm pickaxe in his hands and the impossible echoing from the mine tunnel. A rational man would have explanations: desert heat, grief playing tricks, the mine's way of dealing with isolation and loss. But the tool in his hands was real enough, and Buck's behavior suggested the dog saw and heard the same things. "Tom Baker," Hank said aloud, testing the name. It felt right, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The afternoon sun beat down merciless and hot, but from the mine entrance came a cool breeze that carried scents of deep earth and old stone. Somewhere in that darkness, a man continued his work. 50 years of digging towards something that might never be found, driven by needs that death hadn't been able to quiet. Hank carefully replaced the pickaxe where he'd found it and backed. Away from the mine, Buck pressing close against his legs. Whatever Tom Baker was seeking in those tunnels, it wasn't Hank's place to interfere. Not yet, anyway. The walk back to town gave him time to think. The smart thing would still be to pack, up and leave, chalk up the morning's experiences to a mind cracking under the weight of too much loss. But as he looked around Widow's Reach, really looked, not just at the decay and abandonment, but at the bones of what had once been a community, he saw something else. This place had been loved once. Someone had planted the cottonwood trees that lined the main street, now grown tall and spreading despite the harsh climate. Someone had built the little stone church with care for details that spoke of faith and hope. Someone had carved "Home is where love lives" into the mantel of his cabin, believing those words deeply enough to make them permanent. The Baker family had lived here. They'd raised their children in this place, worked its mine, hung laundry, on lines that caught the desert wind. Whatever had happened to them, accident, disease, the simple passage of time, they'd left something of themselves behind. Maybe that's what ghosts really were, Hank thought as he walked. Not scary things from horror stories, but the love that stays behind when the lovers are gone. The impression left by lives fully lived, by hearts that had found their home and couldn't quite bear to leave it. Back at the cabin, he found Buck sniffing around something near the front steps. The dog's tail was wagging, and when Hank approached, he saw why. Someone had left a mason jar filled with water so cold it beaded with condensation despite the afternoon heat. Beside it sat a covered plate that held sandwiches wrapped in a clean cloth, ham and cheese on fresh bread, with pickles that tasted like they'd come straight from someone's garden. There was no note, no explanation, just food and water offered, with the simple hospitality that belonged to a time when neighbors looked after neighbors without thought of reward. Hank ate the sandwiches sitting on his cabin steps, Buck beside him enjoying the scraps. The bread was perfect, soft and slightly sweet, with the texture that only came from careful kneading and patient rising. Martha had baked bread like this, back in the early years of their marriage when they'd had more time than money, as the sun settled toward the western ridge, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Hank made his decision. Ghost town or not, supernatural neighbors or not, this place felt more like home than anywhere had since Martha died. Whatever the Baker family needed, if they needed anything at all, he was willing to try and provide it. After all, he had nothing but time. And time was something the dead seemed to have in abundance. The children came on the third morning, arriving with the kind of sudden presence that belonged to desert storms and unexpected blessings. Hank was splitting kindling behind the cabin when he heard Buck's bark shift from alert to delighted, the same tone he'd used when Martha would come home from town with surprises in her shopping bags. He looked up to find two small figures standing at the edge of the yard, watching him with the frank curiosity that children brought to everything new and interesting. The girl looked about 8, with dark braids that hung past her shoulders and a dress that might have been fashionable when his own grandmother was young. The boy was smaller, maybe 5, wearing overalls and a serious expression that seemed too old for his face. "Morning," Hank said carefully, setting down his axe. Buck had already trotted over to the children, tail wagging as they scratched behind his ears with the practiced ease of kids who knew their way around animals. "You're the man who bought our town," the girl said. It wasn't a question, just a statement delivered with the matter-of-fact tone children used when stating obvious truths. "I suppose I am. Name's Hank Redfern. This here's Buck. I'm Emma Baker," the girl replied, offering a small hand for him to shake. "This is my brother Jake. Mama says we shouldn't bother you while you're working, but we wanted to see if your dog likes to play." Jake nodded solemnly, then suddenly broke into a grin that transformed his serious face. "Buck's a good name for a dog. Does he know tricks?" Before Hank could answer, Buck was demonstrating his repertoire: sit, stay, shake hands, roll over, while the children clapped and laughed with the pure joy that belonged to young hearts unburdened by the world's complications. Their laughter rang clear as church bells in the desert air, a sound Hank hadn't realized he'd been missing until he heard it again. "He's very smart," Emma observed with the solemnity of a judge. "Mama had a dog once, before we moved here, a little terrier named Buttons. He could catch rats and bark at strangers, but he couldn't do tricks like Buck." "Where's your mama now?" Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "In the house, getting ready to do washing," Jake said. "She does washing every morning, but the clothes never get dry proper. Papa says it's because the air's too thin up here in the mountains." Emma shot her brother a look that carried the weight of older sister wisdom. "The clothes get dry, Jake, just not the way they used to." There was something in her tone, a sadness that seemed too deep for such a young voice, that made Hank's chest tighten. These children carried knowledge they shouldn't have had to learn, understood things that belonged to grown-up conversations held in hushed voices after bedtime. "Would you like to help me with this kindling?" he offered. "I could use some strong hands to stack it proper." Both children lit up at the invitation. They worked with the focused attention that came naturally to the young, sorting wood by size and stacking it with careful precision. Buck supervised from the shade, occasionally offering encouragement in the form of tail wags and gentle woofs. As they worked, the children chattered with the easy openness of kids who'd been raised to trust adults. They told him about their favorite games, hide and seek among the old buildings, exploring the safe parts of the mine tunnels, collecting pretty rocks from the desert floor. Emma had found a piece of turquoise once, blue as winter sky, that she kept in a special box in her room. Jake was fascinated by the old mining equipment, the way the big wheels and pulleys worked together to move heavy loads. "Papa knows all about mining," Jake said proudly. "He can tell just by looking at rock whether it's got silver in it or not. He says someday he's going to find the biggest vein anybody ever saw, and then we'll be rich enough to buy anything we want." "What would you buy?" Hank asked. Jake considered this with the seriousness of a child planning his birthday wish list. "A pony for Emma. She's always wanted a pony. And maybe some new books. The ones we got are getting kind of worn out from reading so many times." Emma smiled at her brother's thoughtfulness. "I'd buy Mama a new dress, a real pretty one from the catalogue, with lace and everything. And I'd get Papa some new tools, so his hands wouldn't hurt so much from all the digging." Their wants were simple, touching in their sweetness. A pony, some books, a pretty dress, better tools. The kinds of dreams that belong to families who measured wealth in love rather than money. Around mid-morning, the children produced a set of marbles from Emma's pocket. Beautiful. Glass spheres that caught the light like captured rainbows. They showed Hank how to play, drawing circles in the dirt and explaining rules that seemed to change with each round, but never in ways that mattered to the fun. The marbles were clearly treasured possessions, worn smooth by countless games, but still brilliant with color. Some were clear glass with swirls of blue and green, trapped inside like miniature storms. Others were solid colors, red as garnets, yellow as summer butter, purple as spring violets. "These belonged to our papa when he was little," Emma explained, as she lined up a particularly difficult shot. "His papa gave them to him, and his papa's papa before that. Someday, Jake will give them to his children." Jake nodded importantly, then proceeded to miss his shot entirely, sending marbles scattering across the dirt. But instead of frustration, this brought fresh peals of laughter from both children, and soon they were all crawling around in the dust, gathering the escaped spheres. It was during this marble chasing that Hank noticed something peculiar. The marbles that rolled into the deeper shadows seemed to hesitate there, as if the darkness were somehow thicker than it should be. And when the children retrieved them, the glass seemed to glow with its own inner light for just a moment before returning to normal. "Do you ever wonder why?" Hank began, then stopped himself. "How did you ask children if they knew they were dead? How did you explain to young hearts that their games and laughter existed in a space between worlds?" "Wonder what, Mr. Hank?" Emma asked, looking up at him with eyes that held more understanding than any 8-year-old should possess. "Wonder why Buck likes you two so much. Usually takes him a while to warm up to new folks." Emma smiled with the wisdom of someone far older than her years. "Animals can tell when people are good," she said simply. "Buck knows we're not gonna hurt nobody. We just want to play and have fun and maybe help with chores if there's any that need doing." As the sun climbed higher, the children's attention turned to other entertainments. They showed Hank their favorite hiding spots among the buildings, the places where the best rocks could be found, the old cottonwood tree that was perfect for climbing despite its age. Through it all, they remained solidly present, not flickering or fading like spirits in stories, but real as the desert earth under their feet. They had weight and substance, cast shadows in the afternoon light, left footprints in the dust. Whatever they were, wherever they'd come from, they were more than mere echoes of the past. When the shadows began to lengthen toward evening, Emma gathered up the marbles with careful attention to each one. "We should go help Mama with supper," she announced. "But we'll come back tomorrow if you want. Buck might get lonely without us." "I'd like that," Hank said, surprised by how much he meant it. "Both Buck and I would like that very much." The children waved goodbye and skipped away toward the center of town, their voices carrying back on the evening breeze as they sang some half-remembered song. Hank watched them go, feeling something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had lived there since Martha's death. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. Sarah Baker's kitchen existed in the space between memory and reality, where the impossible felt as natural as morning. Coffee. Hank found himself there on the fourth evening, drawn by the scent of something wonderful cooking, and the sound of gentle humming that carried across the desert air like a half-remembered lullaby. The house sat at the end of Main Street, larger than the others, built with the kind of care that spoke of a family putting down permanent roots. White paint peeled from its clappered siding, and the front porch sagged under the weight of decades, but the windows glowed with warm yellow light that seemed to push back the gathering dusk. Buck had led the way, trotting confidently up the front steps as if he'd been invited for Sunday dinner. When Hank knocked on the door frame, the screen door hung open in the evening breeze, Sarah's voice called from inside with the easy hospitality of a woman used to unexpected visitors. "Come on in, Mr. Redfern. Supper's almost ready." The kitchen was a marvel of preserved time. Cast-iron pots bubbled on a wood-burning stove that radiated real heat. The air was thick with the scents of roasted chicken, fresh bread and vegetables that somehow thrived in this desert place. A long table dominated the center of the room, set with 4 places as if the family had been expecting him all along. Sarah stood at the stove, her dark hair pinned back, and her blue dress protected by a flour-dusted apron. She looked exactly as she had in the photograph, untouched by the 50 years that should have aged her into someone else entirely. But her smile was warm and real, and when she gestured to a chair at the table, Hank found himself sitting without question. "Emma told me you've been working hard on the old Henley place," she said, ladling something that smelled like heaven into a bowl. "That cabin's got good bones. Samuel Henley built it to last back in '67, right after he struck his first decent vein. You knew him?" "Oh, yes. Sam was a good man, if a bit set in his ways. His wife, Clara, made the finest apple butter this side of the Rockies. They left when the mine played out, moved back east to be near her people. Sarah set the bowl in front of him, chicken and dumplings, rich with vegetables and herbs that made his mouth water. "Eat up, a man can't work on an empty stomach." The food was as real as anything Hank had ever tasted, warming him from the inside out, with flavors that reminded him of church suppers and family gatherings. Sarah moved around the kitchen with the practiced ease of a woman who'd cooked for her family for decades, checking the bread in the oven, stirring pots, setting out butter and preserves in small glass dishes. "The children like you," she said as she worked. "Emma hasn't stopped talking about Buck and those tricks he knows. Jake's been practicing his marble shooting, hoping to impress you next time. They're good kids. You should be proud." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment at the stove, and when she turned to face him, her eyes held a sadness that seemed older than the desert itself. "They are good children, the best a mother could ask for. It's just—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes I worry about them growing up in a place like this. No other children to play with, no school to attend. A town can get awful lonely when it's just family." There was something in her tone that made Hank look up from his bowl. "How long have you folks been here by yourselves? Seems like forever some days." Sarah sat down across from him, her own bowl untouched. "Tom keeps saying the mine will come back, that there's still silver in those hills, if a man knows where to look. But I sometimes wonder if we're just holding on to something that's already gone." She spoke as if the mine closure had happened recently, as if the choice to stay or leave was still being debated around the dinner table. But the calendar in the corner of the kitchen, hanging askew on a rusted nail, showed October 1973, the same year as the family photograph in the general store. "Your husband," Hank said carefully, "he's still working the mine, every day, dawn to dusk. He says he's close to something big, bigger than anything that's come out of these hills before. Tom's always been stubborn about his dreams." Her voice carried the affectionate exasperation of a wife who'd had this conversation many times before. "But I worry about him down there in those tunnels. Some of the supports are getting weak, and he won't listen when I tell him to be careful." The bread timer chimed, and Sarah rose to check the oven. The loaves she pulled out were perfect, golden brown and fragrant, the kind of bread that spoke of skill passed down through generations. She wrapped them in clean towels and set them aside to cool. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Hank nodded, though something about the domestic normalcy of the scene made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. Sarah poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs, the liquid dark and rich as any he'd ever tasted. She added cream from a small pitcher, sugar from a hand-painted bowl, as if these simple pleasures were the most natural things in the world. "I have to ask," Hank said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Don't you ever think about leaving, finding somewhere with more opportunities for the children?" Sarah's laugh was soft and tinged with something that might have been regret. "Where would we go? This is our home, Mr. Redfern. Tom's grandfather staked the first claim in these hills. My own family came here when I was Emma's age. Our roots run deep as the mine shafts." She gestured around the kitchen, taking in the copper pots, the hand-stitched curtains, the recipe book that lay open on the counter with pages yellowed by time and use. "Everything we love is here, the place where we first met, where we were married, where the children were born. How do you leave behind everything that made you who you are?" The recipe book drew Hank's attention. It was thick with handwritten pages, the margins filled with notes and modifications in Sarah's careful script. Some recipes were stained with use. Chocolate cake, Sunday pot roast, Christmas cookies that had been made and remade until the measurements were committed to memory. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the book. Sarah nodded, and he turned the pages slowly, reading entries that spoke of celebrations and ordinary dinners, special occasions, and simple Tuesday nights. Here was the history of a family told in meals shared, and recipes perfected in the kinds of small domestic rituals that made a house into a home. One page made him pause. Written in faded ink was a recipe for apple butter, attributed to Clara Henley, the best neighbor a woman could ask for. Below it, Sarah had added a note. Made this for Tom's birthday, 1972. He ate half the jar before supper was even ready. You really knew the people who lived here before? Oh, yes. Widow's Reach was a real community once. Not big, maybe 40. Families at its peak. But we all looked after each other. The Henleys, the Cooperins, old Pete Vasquez, who ran the general store. During the good years, we had a school, a church, even a little newspaper that came out every other week. Her voice grew wistful as she spoke, painting pictures of a town that had thrived and bustled with life. Children walking to school with lunch pails and bright faces, men heading to the mines in the pre-dawn darkness, their carbide lamps bobbing like fireflies, women gathering for quilting circles and church socials, sharing news and recipes and the small dramas that made up community life. What happened to them all? The mine started playing out in 71, not all at once, but gradual-like, the way these things usually go. Families started leaving for places with more promise. By 73, there weren't enough kids left for a school, not enough congregation for a proper church service. She was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee, though it needed no stirring. Tom kept saying it was temporary, that the vein would open up again if he just kept digging. But I could see the writing on the wall. A town dies slow sometimes, but it still dies. As if summoned by the mention of his name, footsteps sounded on the front porch. Tom Baker came through the door, his work clothes dusty and his hands bearing the calluses of a man who'd spent decades working stone. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own space, hanging his hat on a peg by the door and washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Evening," he said to Hank, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who didn't waste words. "Sarah treating you well?" "She's been more than kind." Tom dried his hands and joined them at the table, accepting the plate Sarah prepared for him without comment. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that belonged to families who'd shared thousands of meals and didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. "Found something interesting today," Tom said eventually, his words directed to Sarah, but his eyes including Hank in the conversation. "New vein, deeper than the others. Looks promising." Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained calm. "You be careful down there, Tom Baker. Those tunnels weren't made for one man working alone." "I'm always careful." He reached across the table to squeeze her hand, the gesture automatic and tender. "But this could be it, Sarah. This could be the one that changes everything." Hank watched the interplay between them, the husband's stubborn hope, the wife's worried love, the delicate balance of a marriage tested by circumstances beyond their control. It was achingly familiar, the kind of conversation he and Martha had shared during the lean years when the ranch struggled and bills piled up like winter snow. As the evening deepened, Hank found himself reluctant to leave. The warmth of the kitchen, the gentle conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with people who cared about each other. It filled empty spaces in his heart that he'd forgotten existed. For the first time since Martha's death, he felt like part of something larger than his own grief. The town bell had been silent for 50 years, its bronze tongue frozen with rust and neglect. Hank discovered it on his second week in Widow's Reach, standing in the small tower beside what had once been the community church. The building itself was sound. Stone foundation, thick timber walls, a roof that had weathered decades of desert storms without giving way. But the bell that should have called people to worship, announced births and deaths, warned of danger, and celebrated victories, hung mute as a forgotten prayer. It used to ring every Sunday morning at 9 sharp, Emma told him as they stood in the church doorway. She and Jake had become his regular companions, appearing each morning to help with whatever project caught his attention. Today, they'd followed him here, drawn by his muttered comments about the sad state of the tower. Papa helped cast that Bell, Jake added with the pride children took in their parents' accomplishments. Him and Mr. Cooper and some other men. They melted down old pots and pans and brass fittings from the mine equipment. Took them 3 tries to get it right. Hank squinted up at the bell, noting the simple beauty of its lines, the way it had been shaped with more care than skill, but plenty of heart. On its side, barely visible through the patina of age, he could make out words cast into the bronze. Widow's Reach Community Bell, 1968. May our voices join as one. Why don't it ring no more? Jake asked, his grammar slipping the way children's did when they were thinking hard about something important. Emma answered before Hank could speak, her voice carrying that note of adult knowledge that seemed too heavy for her years. Because there's nobody left to call silly. Can't have a community bell without a community. The sadness in her words made Hank's chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, in Martha's eyes during the hard years when they'd lost 3 babies before birth, when the doctor had finally told them children weren't in their future. The look of someone learning that some dreams don't come true no matter how hard you wish for them. Well, he said, studying the rope that hung limp and frayed beside the bell. Maybe it's time somebody fixed that. Both children perked up with the sudden interest that belonged to kids, presented with an interesting project. They followed him up the narrow stairs to the bell tower, Buck waiting below with the patience of a dog who'd learned that humans sometimes did inexplicable things that were best observed from a safe distance. The mechanism was simpler than Hank had expected, a wooden wheel and rope system that would have allowed the bell to be rung from below. But the rope had rotted away, and the bronze wheel that should have turned smoothly was seized with rust and accumulated grime. Can you really fix it? Emma asked, peering over his shoulder as he examined the mounting hardware. Don't see why. Not just need some oil, a new rope, maybe a bit of patience. He looked at her seriously. Question is, should I fix it? Seems like it might be lonely, ringing out over an empty town. It wouldn't be lonely, Jake said with the certainty that belonged to childhood logic. We'd hear it. And Buck would hear it, and maybe, he paused, looking uncertain. Maybe what, son? Maybe other people would hear it too. People who are looking for a place to belong. Emma nodded solemnly. Jake's right. A bell that's silent can't call anybody home, but one that rings might reach people who need to hear it. Over the next few days, fixing the bell became a project that drew the whole Baker family. Tom appeared with tools and oil that seemed to come from some supernatural hardware store, his weathered hands working the mechanisms with the skill of a man who understood how things were built to last. Sarah brought sandwiches and lemonade, turning the work into a community event, even though the community consisted of 4 ghosts, 1 living man, and a patient dog. My grandfather helped build this church, Tom said as he worked oil into the bronze wheel, back in '65, when the mine was producing good and people thought Widow's Reach might last forever. He always said a town without a church was just a collection of buildings, not a real community. Was he a religious man? Hank asked, holding a length of new rope while Tom threaded it through the pulley system. Religious enough, but I think he meant something broader than just Sunday services. A place where people could come together, share their troubles and their joys, somewhere that belonged to everybody and nobody all at once. Sarah nodded from her spot on the church steps, where she was mending the rope that would eventually hang down for the bell ringer to pull. The church hosted everything: wedding receptions, funeral dinners, Christmas pageants, town meetings. When the Hernandez baby was born during that terrible blizzard in '69, she was baptized right here because the roads were too bad to get to the county seat. Her fingers moved with practiced ease as she spliced the rope, creating loops and securing knots with the kind of skill that came from a lifetime of making do and making things last. I sang in the choir for 7 years, she added. Never had much of a voice, but Mrs. Patterson said enthusiasm made up for a lot of shortcomings. Emma and Jake had appointed themselves official assistants, handing up tools and fetching water for cleaning decades of accumulated grime from the bell's surface. As the bronze was polished, the inscription became clearer, along with other details. that spoke of the care that had gone into its creation. "Look, Papa," Emma called, pointing to something near the bell's rim. "There's names carved here." Tom climbed up to see, his face breaking into a smile as he read the small letters etched into the metal. "Well, I'll be. The founding families. Look here, Baker, Cooper, Vasquez, Henley, Patterson, and here's something I'd forgotten." He traced one section with his finger, and Hank could see where someone had carved a simple design, two hands clasped in friendship, surrounded by words, too small to read from below. "What's it say?" Jake called up. "In memory of those who came before, in hope for those who come after," Tom read. "And here's the date, July 4th, 1968. We dedicated the bell on Independence Day that year, had a big celebration with food and music and more people than this little valley had seen since the Silver Rush." As they worked, the Baker family shared stories of Widow's Reach in its heyday. The annual harvest festivals where people brought vegetables from their gardens and preserves from their pantries to share. The Christmas pageants where every child in town had a part, even if it was just standing silently with the heavenly host. The summer evenings when families would gather in the churchyard for singing and stories while the children played games in the gathering dusk. "It sounds wonderful," Hank said, and meant it. The picture they painted was of a real community, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and looked after each other as a matter of course. "It was," Sarah said softly. "Not perfect, mind you. We had our disagreements and our troublemakers like any place. But when it mattered, when someone was sick or struggling or needed help, the whole town would come together." "What happened to that spirit when people started leaving?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the rope he was adjusting. "I think it died a little with each family that packed up and moved on. Hard to maintain community feeling when the community keeps getting smaller. Toward the end, there were maybe 8 families left, and we were all so worried about our own problems that we stopped looking out for each other the way we should have." "That's not true, Papa," Emma said firmly. "Remember how the Coopers helped us when Jake was sick with that fever, and how you and Mr. Vasquez fixed the Henley's roof after that bad storm." "She's right," Sarah agreed. "The spirit was still there. It's just harder to see when you're scared about the future." As the afternoon wore on, the bell began to take on new life. The bronze gleamed where they'd polished it, the mechanisms moved smoothly with their new oil and attention, and the rope hung straight and true, ready to translate human effort into the voice of bronze and faith. "Should we test it?" Tom asked, as the sun began to settle toward the western ridge. "Together," Sarah said, gathering her family around the rope. "The way it should be." They each took hold, Tom and Sarah, Emma and Jake, and finally Hank, feeling honored to be included in this moment of restoration. Buck sat at attention nearby, as if he understood the significance of what was about to happen. "On 3, Tom said. 1, 2... The bell's voice rang clear and true across Widow's Reach, its bronze throat singing out over the desert with a song that seemed to wake echoes sleeping in the canyon walls. It was a sound that spoke of gatherings and celebrations, of community and belonging, of voices joined as one across the years and the silence. Birds rose from their roosts in the cottonwood trees, wheeling and calling as if startled by the return of something they'd thought lost forever. The sound rolled across the desert, bouncing off mesas and buttes, carrying its message of life and hope into the gathering evening. When the echoes finally faded, they stood in silence, still holding the rope that connected them all to something larger than themselves. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered. "It's home," Sarah said, and Hank heard in her voice the same longing he'd carried since Martha's death, the desire to belong somewhere, to be part of something that mattered. As they walked back toward the center of town, the restored bell tower, standing proud against the darkening sky, Hank realized something had shifted in his relationship with Widow's Reach. It was no longer just a place to hide from the world. It was becoming something else, a community of souls who'd found each other across the impossible divide between life and death, united by the simple need to belong somewhere. The truth came buried in a metal filing cabinet that Hank found while clearing debris from what had once been the mine office. 3 weeks of living with the Baker family had settled into a rhythm that felt natural as breathing. Morning coffee with Sarah, afternoon projects with the children, evening conversations with Tom about the day's work in the tunnels. But it was the restless energy in Tom's movements, the way his hands shook sometimes when he thought no one was looking, that drove Hank to investigate the abandoned office building. The structure sat halfway up the hillside, built into the rock, faced with the practical efficiency that marked all mining operations. Most of the equipment had been hauled away decades ago, but a few forgotten pieces remained, surveying instruments, sample boxes, and in the back corner, a dented filing cabinet that had somehow escaped the general exodus. The drawers stuck with rust and disuse. But Hank's 40 years of ranch work had taught him patience with stubborn machinery. When the bottom drawer finally gave way, it revealed a collection of documents that someone had either forgotten or deliberately left behind. Mine. Safety reports, geological surveys, correspondence between the Widow's Reach Mining Company and various state agencies. And buried beneath a stack of routine paperwork, a manila folder marked Urgent Safety Inspection, October 1973. Hank's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were photographs that made his stomach clench with recognition. Tunnel, supports cracked and sagging, water damage that had weakened crucial beams, rockfalls that had been hastily cleared but not properly reinforced. The accompanying report was written in the dry language of bureaucracy, but its conclusions were clear enough to chill the blood. Immediate closure recommended. Structural integrity compromised beyond safe repair limits. Continued operation presents imminent danger to all personnel. The report was dated October 15, 1973. It was signed by a state mining inspector named Robert Carlyle and stamped with the seal of the Nevada Department of Mining Safety. At the bottom, someone had written, in red ink, report forwarded to WR Mining Management for immediate action. But there was more. Stapled to the back of the safety report was a carbon copy of a letter on company letterhead, dated 3 days later. Mr. Carlyle, thank you for your recent inspection of our Widow's Reach operation. While we appreciate your concerns, our own engineers have reviewed the conditions you documented and determined that continued operation is feasible with minor modifications. The safety issues you noted are not as severe as your report suggests, and the economic impact of closure at this time would be catastrophic for our investors and the local community. We will be implementing additional safety measures as resources permit. In the meantime, we must respectfully decline your recommendation for immediate closure. Sincerely, Marcus Webb, Regional Manager, Widow's Reach Mining Company. Hank stared at the letter, reading it twice to make sure he understood what he was seeing. The company had been warned. They'd been told in clear official language that the mine was dangerous, that people would die if operations continued. And they'd chosen to ignore the warning. His hands shook as he turned to the next document, a memo marked Internal Use Only, and dated October 30th, 1973. All field reports regarding tunnel stability are to be filed directly with regional management. Local supervisors are not authorized to discuss safety concerns with state inspectors without prior approval. Any employee who violates this policy will be subject to immediate termination. The final document in the folder was a newspaper clipping from the Carson City Herald, dated November 15th, 1973. The headline read, Mine Collapse Kills Family of 4, Widow's Reach Tragedy, Blamed on Equipment Failure. The article was brief, written in the perfunctory style of small-town journalism. It identified the victims as Thomas Baker, 34, his wife Sarah, 31, and their children Emma, 8, and Jacob, 5. The collapse had occurred during the morning shift, when Tom was working a deep tunnel that had been recently inspected and deemed safe by company engineers. Company spokesman Marcus Webb expressed the company's deep sorrow over the tragic accident and announced the immediate closure of the Widow's Reach operation. "The safety of our workers has always been our highest priority," Webb stated. "While this appears to have been an unforeseeable equipment failure, we are conducting a thorough investigation to ensure nothing like this ever happens again." Hank's vision blurred as he read the words, but he forced himself to continue. The article went on to note that the Baker family had been the last residents of Widow's Reach, and that the town would likely be abandoned following the mine closure. There was no mention of safety warnings ignored, no reference to the damming. Inspection report that lay just a few pages away in the same folder. "Equipment failure," Hank whispered to the empty office. But it hadn't been equipment failure. It had been corporate greed and calculated indifference, a decision to risk human lives rather than accept financial loss. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him look up. Through the dirty window, he could see Tom Baker walking up the hillside toward the mine entrance, carrying his lunch pail and wearing the same hopeful expression he'd worn every morning for the past 3 weeks. The same expression he'd probably worn on November 15th, 1973, when he'd kissed his wife goodbye and told his children he'd see them for supper. "Tom!" Hank called out, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. He tried again, louder. "Tom, wait!" The figure paused, turning toward the office building. In the afternoon light, Tom Baker looked solid as any living man, his face creased, with the honest fatigue that came from decades of hard work. But now Hank could see something else in his features, a terrible, grinding determination that spoke of a man driven by forces he didn't fully understand. Hank grabbed the folder and stumbled out of the office, his legs unsteady beneath him. Tom waited patiently as he approached, the same courtesy he'd shown every day since they'd met. "Mr. Redfern, you look troubled. Everything all right? How did you tell a dead man that his death hadn't been an accident? How did you explain to a father that his children had died because someone in a corporate office had decided their lives were worth less than a quarterly profit margin?" "Tom," Hank began, then stopped. The words seemed too big, too terrible to speak aloud. "I found something. In the mine office. Documents." Tom's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of knowledge that had been buried but never quite forgotten. "What kind of documents?" Hank opened the folder with hands that shook like autumn leaves. He showed Tom the safety report first, watching the miner's face as he read about tunnel collapses and structural failures, about dangers that should have shut down the operation months before the final tragedy. Tom's fingers traced the inspector's signature, the official seal, the stark recommendations that had been ignored. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so deep it seemed to echo from the center of the earth. "They knew," he said simply. "Yes, they knew, and they kept the mine open anyway." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the documents that changed everything he'd believed about his family's fate. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from 50 years of accumulated grief. "I remember that. Inspector, nice fellow, seemed to know his business. He spent 2 days going through every tunnel, taking pictures, measuring things. Told me he was writing up his report, that we'd hear back soon. Did you ever see the report?" "No. Company said everything was fine, that the inspector had given us a clean bill of health. Webb himself came down from the regional office to tell us, said there might be some minor modifications needed, but nothing that would affect production." The betrayal in Tom's voice was fresh, as if it had happened yesterday, and perhaps in the strange, timeless space where the Baker family existed, it had happened yesterday, every day. A wound that couldn't heal because the truth had been buried along with their bodies. "Sarah was worried," Tom continued, his gaze turning toward the mine entrance. "Said she'd been having bad dreams about cave-ins and tunnel collapses. wanted me to find work somewhere else, maybe move back to Colorado where her sister lived. But I told her not to worry, that the company wouldn't keep us working if it wasn't safe. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I trusted them, believed them when they said everything was fine, even brought Emma and Jake to work with me that morning because it was a school holiday and Sarah had to help Mrs. Patterson with her canning. Thought it would be fun for them to see what their daddy did all day. The full horror of it hit Hank like a physical blow. The children hadn't been in the mine by accident. Tom had brought them there himself, trusting in safety assurances that were lies built on corporate calculations and acceptable risk assessments. "It wasn't your fault," Hank said, but the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of Tom's guilt and grief. "Wasn't it? I was the one who brought them down there. I was the one who believed what I wanted to believe instead of listening to. My wife's fears." Tom's hands clenched into fists. 50 years I've been digging in those tunnels, trying to find something worth the price we paid. 50 years looking for a reason why my family had to die. And now you know the reason. Yes. Tom's voice was flat, empty of everything except a terrible clarity. Now I know the reason. They died so Marcus Webb could avoid writing off a quarterly loss. They died so some stockholders in Denver wouldn't see their dividends reduced. They died because a company decided that 4 lives were an acceptable cost of doing business. The folder trembled in Hank's hands as he showed Tom the rest of the documents. The cover-up letter, the internal memo about hiding safety concerns, the sanitized newspaper account that blamed equipment failure instead of corporate negligence. "What happened to Webb?" Tom asked when he'd read everything. "I don't know, but I can find out." For the first time since Hank had known him, Tom Baker smiled. But it was a smile that belonged to winter nights and deep graves, cold as starlight and twice as distant. "Yes," he said. "I think it's time we found out what happened to Marcus Webb, and what happened to the Widow's Reach Mining Company, and everyone else who decided my family's lives were worth less than their profits." As they stood there in the afternoon sun, surrounded by the ruins of a town built on lies and broken promises, Hank felt something fundamental shift in the very air around them. The Baker family's gentle presence, their quiet acceptance of their fate, had been transformed into something else entirely. For 50 years, they'd been trapped in widow's reach by their own unfinished business, by the need to understand why. They died, now they knew. And with that knowledge came a hunger for justice that death itself couldn't satisfy. The truth had set them free. But freedom came with its own terrible obligations. The letters found Hank that evening, while he sat, alone in his cabin, the weight of the day's revelations pressing down on him like the desert heat itself. Buck had retreated to the corner, sensing the emotional storm brewing in his master's heart, while Hank stared at the documents spread across his small table like evidence of an unfinished crime. He'd been searching through his own belongings, looking for something that might help with the research Tom had requested, when his fingers found the shoebox he'd packed without thinking, Martha's letters. 3 decades worth of correspondence from the early years of their marriage, when his work on distant ranches had sometimes kept them apart for weeks at a time. Her handwriting was as familiar as his own heartbeat, the careful loops and graceful curves that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists, love notes tucked into his lunch pail, and Christmas wishes that made him believe in magic. But it was one letter in particular that stopped him cold, dated July 15th, 1985. "My dearest Hank," it began, "I know you're worried about taking the job with the law firm in Carson City, but I think it's exactly what you need. You've always had a gift for seeing the truth when others want to hide it, and Mr. Patterson says there's real work to be done, exposing companies that think profit matters more than people." She'd written about a case the law firm was building against mining companies that had knowingly exposed workers to dangerous conditions, about families who'd lost fathers and sons and husbands to corporate greed disguised as acceptable risk. Martha had believed in justice the way some people believed in sunrise, with absolute faith that truth would eventually find its way to the light. "You could make a difference, honey," the letter continued. "Not just for the families who've already lost so much, but for the ones who might be saved if the right person is willing to stand up and fight. I know it scares you, taking on something this big, but I also know you're the man for the job. You see people really see them in a way that lawyers and politicians never do. That's your gift, and maybe it's time to use it." Hank had never taken that job. The ranch had needed him, and the idea of courtrooms and legal battles had seemed too far removed from the practical work of fixing fence and tending cattle. But now, reading Martha's words again, he felt the gentle pressure of her conviction reaching across the years. The next morning brought a town meeting unlike any widow's reach had seen in 50 years. The Baker family gathered in the church, their faces grave with purpose and hope mixed in equal measure. Even Buck seemed to understand the seriousness of the occasion, sitting quietly at Hank's feet instead of wandering off to explore interesting scents. "I've been thinking all night about what we learned yesterday," Sarah began, her hands folded in her lap with the composure that belonged to women who'd faced unthinkable losses and survived them. "About the truth that's been buried all these years, about the people who knew what was going to happen and let it happen anyway." Tom sat beside her, the mining documents stacked neatly in front of him. His face looked older somehow, as if learning the truth about their deaths had aged him in ways that 50 years of ghostly existence hadn't managed. "The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we make sure it matters?" "We tell everyone," Emma said with the straightforward logic that belonged to children who hadn't yet learned that the world was complicated. "We tell everyone what really happened, so they know the truth." "But who's going to listen to us, sweetheart?" Sarah asked gently. "Who's going to believe the testimony of people who've been dead for half a century?" Jake, who'd been quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly perked up with an idea. "Mr. Hank could tell them. He's alive. People listen to alive people." All eyes turned to Hank, and he felt the weight of their hope settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. These people, this family, had become more real to him than most of the living folks he'd known. Their trust meant something, carried obligations that went deeper than friendship or neighborly kindness. "I can try," he said carefully. "But it's been 50 years. Most of the people involved are probably dead or retired. Companies change names, get bought out, disappear entirely. It might be impossible to track down anyone who's still accountable. The truth doesn't disappear just because the people who buried it are gone," Tom said quietly. "And maybe accountability isn't just about punishing the guilty. Maybe it's about making sure future families don't go through what we did." Over the next week, Hank threw himself into research with the focused determination that had once driven him to mend every broken fence post on his ranch before winter set in. The nearest library was a 2-hour drive to the county seat, but the librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Chen, who seemed to view information requests as personal challenges, helped him navigate the maze of corporate records and newspaper archives. The Widow's Reach Mining Company had been dissolved in 1974, its assets sold to a larger corporation that had been subsequently bought out by an even larger conglomerate. The trail led through a dozen name changes and mergers, but the current ownership could be traced to Consolidated Western Resources, a multinational company with operations across the western United States. Marcus Webb had retired in 1985 with a comfortable pension and moved to a gated community in Arizona, where he'd lived quietly until his death in 2003. But his successor, a man named Douglas Kramer, was still alive and serving as a senior consultant for Consolidated Western. The inspector who'd filed the original safety report, Robert Carlyle, had passed away in 1998, but his son David was a practicing attorney in Reno who specialized in mining safety cases. Each piece of information felt like a small victory, another step toward the justice the Baker family deserved. But with each discovery, Hank also felt the magnitude of what he was attempting to do, taking on a multinational corporation with nothing but 50-year-old documents and the testimony of a family the world believed was dead. It seemed like the kind of impossible task that belonged in storybooks rather than real life. It was during one of these research trips that Hank met Jennifer Reeves, the investigative journalist who would change everything. She was waiting by his truck in the library parking lot, a woman in her 40s with the kind of alert eyes that suggested she saw stories where other people saw statistics. "Mr. Redfern, I'm Jennifer Reeves from the Nevada Tribune. I understand you've been researching the Widow's Reach mine disaster. I wonder if we could talk." Hank's first instinct was to drive away, to protect the Baker family's story from the kind of sensationalism that turned human tragedy into entertainment. But something in the woman's manner, a respectful directness that reminded him of Martha, made him reconsider. "Depends on what you want to talk about." "Justice," she said. "Simply, I've been investigating mining safety cover-ups for the past 10 years. The pattern is always the same. Companies ignore warnings, people die, and then the truth gets buried under legal settlements and corporate reorganizations. When Mrs. Chen mentioned that someone was researching Widow's Reach, it caught my attention, because I'd heard rumors about that case for years. They talked for 3 hours in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt grounds and unrealized dreams. Hank carefully sharing what he'd learned while Jennifer filled in gaps with her own research. She'd found references to the Widow's Reach cover-up in congressional testimony from the 1980s, mentions of destroyed documents and intimidated witnesses that painted a picture of systematic corruption extending far beyond one small mining operation. "The beautiful thing about truth," Jennifer said as their conversation wound down, "is that it has a way of surviving even when powerful people try to kill it. Documents get hidden but not destroyed. Witnesses keep quiet for decades and then decide they want to clear their consciences before they die. Corporate executives write memoirs and accidentally reveal things they shouldn't." She leaned forward, her voice carrying the intensity of someone who'd devoted her career to fighting battles most people didn't even know were being fought. "What you found, Mr. Redfern, those original safety reports, the cover-up correspondence, that's solid. Gold. With the right approach, the right publicity, this could force Consolidated Western to acknowledge what really happened. Maybe even provide some compensation for the families affected." "There's only one family affected," Hank said quietly. "And they're all dead." "Are they?" Jennifer's question carried implications that made Hank's chest tighten. "Because from what you've told me, it sounds like they're very much still present in Widow's Reach. And if that's true, then maybe they deserve to have their story told properly, with all the dignity and respect they were denied 50 years ago." That night, Hank returned to Widow's Reach with more hope than he'd felt since Martha's death. The Baker family listened as he described his conversation with Jennifer, their faces brightening with each detail about media coverage and corporate accountability. "She wants to tell our story?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a wonder that belonged to people who'd been invisible for too long. "More than that, she wants to make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened here, about how you lived, how you died, and why it matters that people remember." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands tracing patterns on the church table where they'd gathered. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of finality that suggested important decisions were being made. 50 years we've been waiting for someone to see us, to acknowledge that we existed, that our lives meant something. Now we have that chance." He looked around at his family, his eyes lingering on each face with the tenderness of a man who knew that time was precious, even for the dead. "But there's something else we need to discuss. Something we've all been avoiding." Sarah's hand found their fingers intertwining with the automatic comfort of a couple who'd weathered decades of joy and sorrow together. "You mean what happens after? When the truth comes out and people know our story, will we still be here? Emma asked, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that pierced Hank's heart. Or will telling the truth mean we have to go away? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of them wanted to confront. But Hank could see in their faces that they'd all been thinking about it, wrestling with the possibility that finding justice might mean losing each other. I don't know, he admitted, but I know that whatever happens, you won't be forgotten. Your story will live on, and people will remember the Baker family not as victims, but as people who fought for the truth, even after death couldn't stop them. Jake, who'd been unusually quiet throughout the discussion, suddenly stood up with the decisive energy that belonged to children who'd made important decisions. I think we should do it. I think we should tell everyone what really happened, even if it means we have to go away. Why, sweetheart? Sarah asked. Because other kids might still be alive somewhere, and if we tell the truth, maybe their daddies won't have to work in dangerous places. Maybe their families won't have to go through what we did. In that moment, Jake Baker, 5 years old for eternity, spoke with the wisdom of someone who understood that love sometimes meant sacrifice, that protecting others might require giving up the only home they'd known for 50 years. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. They would trust Hank to tell their story, to work with Jennifer Reeves and anyone else who could help bring the truth to light. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, the Baker family would finally have their voices heard. The town bell rang at dawn on the day that would change everything, its bronze voice carrying across the desert with a clarity that seemed to reach beyond the physical world into realms where justice and truth resided. Hank woke to its call, knowing without being told that the Baker family had gathered to ring it together one last time, before the outside world descended on their quiet sanctuary. By the time he reached the church, news vans were already visible. On the horizon, distant dust clouds that spoke of reporters and camera crews making their way along the 15 miles of dirt road that connected Widow's Reach to the larger world. Jennifer Reeves had been busy in the 2 weeks since their coffee shop conversation, and her story about the mining cover-up had generated the kind of media attention that turned forgotten tragedies into national conversations. "They're coming," Sarah said simply, standing beside the bell tower with her family gathered around her. She wore her best dress, the blue one from the photograph, and her hair was pinned back with the kind of care that spoke of special occasions and important moments. Tom stood beside her in his cleanest work clothes, the mining documents tucked under his arm in a leather portfolio that had somehow materialized from whatever realm supplied the Baker family's necessities. The children flanked their parents, Emma holding her precious marbles in a small cloth bag, while Jake clutched a toy horse that Hank had never seen before, but that looked worn with decades of love. "Are you ready for this?" Hank asked, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing them or himself. "We've been ready for 50 years, Tom replied. "Just didn't know what we were getting ready for until now." The first news van arrived at 9 o'clock, followed by 2 more within the hour. Jennifer Reeves led the convoy in her own vehicle, and Hank was relieved to see that she'd kept her word about approaching the story with dignity and respect. The reporters and camera operators who climbed out of their vehicles moved with the careful reverence that belonged to people who understood they were documenting something extraordinary. Jennifer found Hank first, her eyes bright with the energy that came from breaking important stories. "The response has been incredible," she told him as they walked toward the church where the Baker family waited. 3 congressional offices have called, asking for copies of the documents. The EPA wants to launch a review of mining safety enforcement. And Consolidated Western stock price dropped 12% yesterday after word leaked about the cover-up. What about the Baker family? Are people ready to accept? Hank gestured toward the church, where 4 figures waited with the patient dignity of people who'd spent decades preparing for this moment. "I've prepared them as much as I can," Jennifer said carefully. "But honestly, Mr. Redfern, I'm not sure anyone can really be prepared for this. The documents speak for themselves, and your testimony as the person who found them carries weight. As for the rest, well, sometimes truth is stranger than anything people can imagine." The first interview took place in the church, with Tom and Sarah seated at the table where they'd held their family meetings for weeks. The camera operator, a young man with kind eyes who'd introduced himself as Miguel, set up his equipment. With the respectful efficiency of someone who understood he was documenting history, Jennifer conducted the interview with the skill of a journalist who'd spent years coaxing truth from reluctant sources. But the Baker family needed no coaxing. They spoke with the calm directness of people who'd waited half a century to tell their story, their voices carrying across the decades with undiminished clarity. Tom described the morning of November 15th, 1973, with the detailed precision of someone who'd relived those moments countless times. He spoke of bringing his children to work because it was a school holiday, of the safety assurances from company management, of the tunnel collapse that had taken their lives in seconds but trapped their spirits for 50 years. Sarah shared her memories of the community that had once thrived in Widow's Reach, of neighbors who'd looked after each other, and children who'd played in streets that now lay empty, except for tumbleweeds and ghosts. Her voice broke only once when she described the dreams she'd had about tunnel collapses, the fears she'd shared with her husband that had been dismissed as women's foolishness. The children spoke last, their young voices carrying truths that seemed impossible but felt absolutely real to everyone in that dusty church. Emma talked about the games they'd played while waiting for their parents to understand why they couldn't move on, while Jake described the loneliness of a town where no other children lived or visited. As the interview progressed, something extraordinary began to happen. The camera equipment, which had been functioning normally at the start, began to capture things that shouldn't have been possible. The digital displays showed the Baker family with perfect clarity, their images as sharp and detailed as any living subjects. Miguel checked his equipment twice, certain there had to be some technical explanation, but the recordings played back with the same impossible clarity. "This is really happening," he whispered to Jennifer during a brief break. "They're really here. I can see them through the camera, hear their voices through the audio equipment. But when I look directly," he gestured helplessly toward the table where the family sat, waiting patiently for the interview to resume. Jennifer nodded, her own composure maintained through years of professional training and sheer force of will. "Just keep recording," she said quietly. "Whatever this is, wherever they are, their story deserves to be told." The revelation of the mining company documents formed the centerpiece of the interview. Tom's hands shook as he displayed the safety report that had been ignored, the corporate correspondence that revealed the cover-up, the newspaper clipping that had blamed equipment failure instead of criminal negligence. "They knew," he said, his voice carrying the accumulated pain of 50 years. "They knew the tunnels were unsafe, knew that people would die if the mine stayed open. But they chose profits over lives, and when we died, they covered it up to protect themselves." The interview concluded with a moment that would become the most replayed segment of the entire broadcast. Jennifer asked the Baker family what they hoped to accomplish by telling their story, and it was Jake who answered with the simple wisdom that belonged to children who'd learned hard truths too young. "We want other kids to be safe," he said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held depths no 5-year-old should possess. "We want their daddies to come home every day, and we want the people who make the rules to remember that families are more important than money." As the news crews packed up their equipment and prepared to carry the Baker family's story to the world, Hank noticed something that made his chest tighten with emotion. The restored town bell, which had stood silent since their dawn gathering, began to ring again, not with the earthly pull of human hands on rope, but with a voice that seemed to come from the desert itself. carrying a message of justice and remembrance across the vast spaces where truth sometimes lived in exile until someone was brave enough to call it home. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, rippling across news networks and social media with the kind of viral intensity that belonged to truths too powerful to contain. By noon, the phrase "widow's reach" was trending nationally, and by evening, Consolidated Western Resources had issued a statement denying any knowledge of safety violations while promising a thorough internal review of historical records. But it was the photograph that changed everything, the image that appeared on the final frame of Miguel's recording, clear as life itself. The Baker family stood together in front of their restored church, Emma and Jake flanked by their parents, all four of them looking directly into the camera with expressions of peace that seemed to transcend the physical. A world. Behind them, barely visible in the desert light, stood the town bell tower, its bronze voice frozen in mid-ring, as if time itself had stopped to capture this moment of truth, finally spoken. The photo should have been impossible. Digital cameras didn't capture spirits. Recording equipment didn't document conversations with the dead, yet there it was, displayed on television screens and computer monitors around the world. Proof that some stories transcended the boundaries between life and death, between justice and mercy. Hank sat in his cabin that evening, watching the coverage on a small television that Jennifer had brought from town. Buck lay at his feet, occasionally whining softly, as if he sensed the approaching change in their small world. Through the window, Hank could see the Baker house glowing with its usual warm light, but something felt different about the glow. Softer somehow, as if it were beginning to fade. A knock at his door interrupted his troubled thoughts. Sarah stood on his threshold, her face serene but touched with the kind of sadness that belonged to necessary farewells. "May I come in? There's something we need to discuss." They sat at his small table, sharing coffee that tasted like every perfect cup Martha had ever brewed, and every meal Sarah had prepared with love. Outside, the desert night wrapped around Widow's Reach with the gentle embrace of something coming to an end. "It's working," Sarah said simply. "What we hoped for, what we planned for. The truth is out there now, and people are listening." Tom heard on the radio that 3 other mining companies have announced voluntary safety reviews. The governor is calling for new legislation. Congressional hearings are being scheduled. That's good news. Yes, it is, the best news we could have hoped for. She paused, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. But there's something else happening, something we knew might come but hoped we'd have. More time to prepare for. Hank's chest tightened. "You're leaving." "We're being called home, really home, not this place between worlds where we've been waiting all these years, ever since we told our story on camera, ever since the truth went out into the world. We've felt it, a pulling, a sense that our work here is finished." Through the window, Hank could see Tom walking slowly toward the mine entrance, but his steps looked different now, lighter, as if some tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Emma and Jake played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the night air with a joy that seemed too bright for the earthly world to contain much longer. "When?" Hank asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Soon. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Time works differently for us, but we can feel it ending. This existence, this waiting, the purpose that kept us here has been fulfilled." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm and real and heartbreakingly temporary. "We wanted to thank you, Hank, for seeing us, for believing in us, for giving us the chance to tell our story. Without you, we would have waited forever in silence." "You gave me something too," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. "A reason to care again, a family when I thought I'd lost mine forever." "Oh, sweetheart." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that caught the lamplight like scattered stars. "You haven't lost your family. Martha's love, our friendship. That doesn't disappear just because we have to go. Love is the one thing that survives everything, even death." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at her children playing their eternal games under stars that seem brighter than usual. There's something else, something we discovered when we started feeling the call to leave. What? We're not the only ones who've been waiting. There are others, families, individuals, people who died with unfinished business or untold truths. We've started seeing them, talking to them. Our story going public, it's opened a door for others who need their voices heard. The implications of this revelation settled over Hank like a revelation. You mean Widow's Reach might not stay empty after you're gone? Exactly. This place, what you've made it, a sanctuary for truth, a place where the silenced can finally speak. I think it's going to continue. Other spirits will come, other stories will need telling, and they'll need someone living to help them, someone who understands that justice doesn't end with death. As if summoned by their conversation, the front door opened and Tom entered, followed by Emma and Jake. The children ran to Hank, wrapping their arms around him with the fierce affection that belonged to final farewells. Tom approached more slowly, carrying something in his hands. "We wanted to give you this," Tom said, extending a framed photograph that Hank had never seen before. It showed the Baker family standing in front of their house, but they weren't alone. Beside them stood Hank and Buck, all of them smiling with the easy joy of people who'd found their chosen family. "We don't know how it was taken or when, but it appeared in our house this afternoon. Maybe it's a gift from whatever power decides these things, a way of saying that some bonds survive everything." The photograph was impossible, like everything else about the Baker family's existence. But as Hank held it, feeling its weight and reality, he knew it would become one of his most treasured possessions. "There's one more thing," Emma said, pulling the cloth bag of marbles from her pocket. "We want you to keep these for the next children who come, so they'll have something to play with while their families figure out how to tell their stories." Jake nodded solemnly. "And when they're ready to go home, they can leave the marbles for the next kids. That way, there'll always be games and always be hope." As the evening deepened toward midnight, the Baker family prepared for their final departure from Widow's Reach. They moved through their house with the careful attention of people saying goodbye to a beloved home, touching familiar objects and sharing memories that had sustained them through 50 years of waiting. The family photograph that had started Hank's journey, the one he'd found in the general store, began to glow with a soft internal light. As he watched, the figures in the picture seemed to step forward, becoming three-dimensional, walking out of the frame and into the larger world beyond. "It's time," Sarah said softly. They gathered in the church one final time, standing beneath the bell tower where they'd rung in the dawn of their last day in Widow's Reach. Tom pulled the rope, and the bell sang out across the desert with a voice that seemed to carry their gratitude and love into every corner of the night. As the echoes faded, so did the Baker family. Not all at once, but gradually, like morning mist touched by sunrise. Tom and Sarah held hands as they faded, their love for each other visible even as their forms became translucent. Emma and Jake ran toward some light that only they could see, their laughter echoing long after their shapes had disappeared. Hank stood alone in the church, Buck pressed against his legs, feeling the emptiness that followed great departures. But it wasn't the hollow emptiness of loss. It was the fertile emptiness of a field prepared for new planting, a stage cleared for the next act in an ongoing drama of truth and justice. The town bell rang once more, soft as a whispered blessing. And Hank knew that his real work in Widow's Reach was just beginning. Spring came to Widow's Reach with a gentleness that surprised even the desert, bringing wildflowers that bloomed in colors Hank had never seen in this harsh landscape. 6 months had passed since the Baker family's departure. 6 months since their story had rippled out into the world like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that continued to spread far beyond their small valley. The congressional hearings had led to new mining safety legislation. Consolidated Western Resources had quietly settled several wrongful death lawsuits and established a fund for families affected by mining accidents. 3 company executives had been indicted for obstruction of justice based on documents that had somehow survived decades of corporate reorganization. Jennifer Reeves had won a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of the story, which she dedicated to the Baker family and all the voices that wait patiently to be heard. But it was the changes to Widow's Reach itself that filled Hank with the deepest satisfaction. The town was no longer empty, not bustling with life the way it had been in its mining heyday, but occupied in ways that transcended the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. They came quietly, usually at dawn or dusk when the light was soft and the veils between worlds grew thin. Spirits who had been waiting for their own chances to speak, to seek justice, to find peace. There was Maria Santos, a young mother who'd died in a factory fire in 1954 when safety exits had been locked to prevent theft. She appeared in the old general store, arranging phantom inventory while she waited for her story to be told. Her gentle presence filled the building with the scent of roses and the sound of Spanish lullabies that drifted on the evening breeze. James Cooper, one of Tom's old mining partners, had returned to work the claims he'd left behind when consumption took his lungs in 1969. He died knowing that his safety reports had been suppressed, that other miners continued to breathe the dust that had killed him. His spirit found peace only after Hank helped expose the company's systematic cover-up of respiratory hazards. The Nakamura family had arrived in winter, parents and 2 small children who died in an internment camp during the war. Their deaths covered up to hide the negligence that had allowed a preventable disease outbreak. They'd taken residence in the old schoolhouse, where the children played with Emma's marbles, while their parents waited for historians to acknowledge what had really happened behind the barbed wire. Each story was different, but the pattern remained the same. Lives lost to corporate greed, government negligence, or systematic indifference, their truths buried to protect the powerful and comfortable. One by one, Hank helped them tell their stories, working with journalists and historians and activists who'd been drawn to Widow's Reach by the growing awareness that some injustices transcended death itself. The sign at the town's entrance had been replaced, though Hank had kept the old marker as a reminder of where they'd started. The new sign, carved from desert stone and mounted on sturdy posts, read simply, "Baker's Rest, where truth lives forever." Below it, in smaller letters that caught the morning light, were the words Emma had suggested. Every voice matters. Every story counts. Every truth deserves to be heard. The town had developed its own rhythm, its own routines that accommodated both the living and the dead. Hank maintained the buildings, tended a small garden that somehow produced vegetables despite the harsh climate, and served as a bridge between the spirits who sought justice and the living world that had the power to provide it. Buck had adapted to their unusual neighbors with the philosophical acceptance that belonged to dogs, who'd learned that the world contained more wonders than could be explained by simple logic. He seemed to enjoy the company of the ghost children, playing games that spanned decades and chasing phantom balls that appeared and disappeared according to rules that only he understood. Jennifer Reeves visited regularly, often bringing other journalists, researchers, and advocates who'd been touched by the stories emerging from Baker's Rest. The town had become an informal center for historical justice, a place where long-buried truths could find their voice and forgotten victims could finally receive the acknowledgement they deserved. On this particular spring morning, as Hank sat on his porch, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and rose, he felt Martha's presence more clearly than he had since her death, not as a ghost or spirit, but as a warm certainty that she approved of the life he'd built in this impossible place. "You found your purpose after all," he could almost hear her saying, her voice carrying the gentle humor that had sustained them through 40 years of marriage. "Took you long enough." The town bell began to ring, calling attention to the arrival of someone new. Hank stood and walked toward the church, Buck trotting beside him with the easy companionship that had sustained them both through grief and discovery. and the strange kind of family they'd found among the dead. A young woman stood beside the bell tower, her clothes suggesting the 1920s, her face bearing the patient sadness that belonged to souls who'd been waiting decades for their chance to speak. In her hands, she carried a photograph of herself with a group of other women, all of them wearing the white armbands that marked them as suffragettes. "Excuse me," she said as Hank approached, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed these words for nearly a century. "My name is Catherine Mills. I died in police custody in 1923 after being arrested for protesting for women's voting rights. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, but you know different," Hank finished gently. "And you've been waiting for someone to listen to the real story." Catherine's face lit up with hope and relief. "Yes, that's exactly right. I've been waiting so long for someone who would understand, someone who could help make sure people know what really happened to us." Hank gestured toward the church, where other spirits had begun to gather, the growing community of souls who'd found refuge in Baker's Rest, who'd discovered that death didn't have to mean silence if someone was willing to listen and fight for truth. "Well, Catherine Mills," he said, using the same tone he'd once used to welcome neighbors to his ranch, "you've come to the right place. We're all about truth here, and second chances, and making sure every voice gets heard. Let's sit down and talk about your story." As they walked toward the church together, the restored bell continued to ring, its bronze voice carrying across the desert with a message that had drawn the forgotten and silenced for months now, the promise that in Baker's Rest every truth mattered, every injustice could find its voice, and every soul who'd been denied dignity in death could finally find peace through the simple act of being heard. Buck bounded ahead of them, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who knew that another story was about to begin, another chapter in the ongoing saga of a ghost town that had become something unprecedented in all the world, a place where the dead could finally rest by ensuring the living never forgot the truths that mattered most. Behind them, the town sign caught the morning light, its carved promise gleaming like a beacon for all the voices that had yet to find their way home. Every voice matters. Every story counts. Every truth deserves to be heard. And in the growing warmth of the desert sun, that promise felt as solid and permanent as the stone from which it was carved, as enduring as love itself, and as real as the impossible family that had taught an old man that sometimes the most important work begins exactly when you think your story is ending.